Hello, good afternoon. Um, Welcome to this episode of Arts and Humanities Conversation at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today's dialogue is on why inequalities in film and technology matter. So we have two distinguished scholars to share their research and experiences and their reflection on this topic. So before we begin our discussion, so let me quickly introduce our scholars today. So we have Professor Elmo Gonzaga, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies, where he teaches translation screen studies, global critical theories, and Asian urban humanities. He obtained his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His book, Monsoon Marketplace, is under contract with Fordham University Press. His research has been published or will be published in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Cultural Studies, Positions, Asia Critique, Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, FIRS, Studies in Global Asias, and the Journal of Asian Studies. So, another scholar we have today is Professor Ron Darwin, who is assistant professor in the Department of English here at CUHK. He teaches digital literacies and digital technology for language learning. He obtained his PhD from the University of British Columbia, and his research uh, on, on the digital inequalities of immigrant youth received the 2020 Dissertation Award of the American Association of Applied Linguistics. So Dr. Darwin's research has been published in the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics and Language at Society. So welcome and thank you for your time, Dr. Darwin and Dr. Gonzaga. So just to have a like quick, uh, you know, introduction of how we proceed today. So basically, Dr. Darwin and Dr. Gonzaga will be sharing their perspective from their research for first 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will pick up questions. So audience, so you can actually type in your question on Q&A button. So I will pick up the questions and I request Dr. Darwin and Dr. Gonzaga to address those questions. So without any delay, so let's move on to our scholars, so panelists today. Now, Dr. Gonzaga, so I'd like to go first.
Yeah, thanks so much, Prem, for the generous introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. So I'm sure you have better use of your time, but then thanks very much for listening in today. Let me share my screen. Uh, okay, let me just double check my settings. Okay. And I'll be showing you a few clips. So just let us know if you have any trouble hearing the audio. So I just wanted to thank Professor Connie Kwong, our Associate Dean for Education, for inviting us to give the talk. And also thanks to our Dean, Max Xiaobingtang, for his support. And also many thanks to our colleagues from the faculty office, Holly Yip and Kubi Yun, for their help in organizing this event. So my talk today will focus on the economic inequalities that we often fail to notice in the popular movies that we watch. So these are some films that you might have seen or might have heard of. And these are examples of films that have explored class inequalities in industrialized cities, experiencing what's called de-industrialization and underemployment. So industrialized cities that have slowing economies. So these films include last year's Oscar winner, Parasite, a film like Korieda's Shoplifters, Lee Chang-dong's Burning, and this year's Oscar favorite, Nomadland. So all of these films were produced over the past few years, around 2018 to 2020. But instead of looking at films set in a single location, such as Tokyo or Seoul, I'm interested in how films with contrasting settings might suggest a hierarchy between their actual locations. So if you're familiar with film studies, it's actually similar to literary studies in that it dwells on the analysis of character or plot. So this would mean looking at the motivations of characters or the resolution of conflict in a plot. So that's how film studies will usually analyze a character or plot. But in my case, I've become more and more interested in fragments of images that circulate. So fragments of images that circulate as people watch films or view television series on and off on their smartphones through the course of their day. Now, because of the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, we've grown more conscious of inequalities, of racial and gender inequalities in the images we consume and the people who produce them. So in my work, I aim to dissect the seemingly neutral, natural, and innocent representations of bodies and things that hover in the background. Many production companies in the US and the UK have aimed to expand their markets by trying to appeal to audiences around the world by featuring characters or settings in other locations. So some governments in both the national and local levels, such as that of Singapore or Seoul, for instance, offer generous incentives for studios to shoot in their locations in the form of tax rebates or production subsidies. And that's why we've been seeing more and more movies and series shot in Singapore. So I'm not sure if you've noticed all these films that have come out recently shot in Singapore, such as Hitman Agent 47. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen that film. It's pretty obscure and not very well done. Or the sequel to Independence Day Resurgence from 2016. And more recently, a TV series, Westworld, had its season 3 set in Singapore. And then another film that was very popular a couple of years ago, which is Crazy Rich Asians, is also set in Singapore. I think was one of those films that has been acclaimed for spotlighting Southeast Asian characters, plots, and settings. Similar to this recent release from Pixar, Raya and the Last Dragon, which came out last week. These are films that have been acclaimed, films that have been acclaimed for spotlighting Southeast Asian characters and locations, but they've also been criticized for engaging in what's called cultural amalgamation and erasure. So while on the one hand, Raya and the Last Dragon effaces the complex differences among various Southeast Asian cultures, Crazy Rich Asians has been criticized for rendering invisible the Malay and Indian Singaporeans who comprise 20% of Singapore's population. Now, in my talk today, I'm interested in sci-fi and spy films. And I'll be sharing with you some examples of these works from different media franchises, such as the James Bond, Jason Bourne, Transformers, and Pacific Rim media franchises. And I'll be talking about how they propagate hierarchies between different East Asian and Southeast Asian cities through their visualization of their settings. Now, Tokyo has provided for a long time the template for the urban future in the Hollywood imagination. So the quintessential image of its cityscape comes from the sci-fi masterpiece Blade Runner all the way back in 1982, which being made in the early 1980s was produced around the time of Japan's economic boom. Now, Blade Runner's image of the urban future is said to combine visual elements such as skyscrapers and neon lights, not just from Tokyo, but then also from Hong Kong, which were supposedly the two most prosperous Asian cities during the 1970s and 1980s. In visual culture, the towering height of skyscrapers often signifies a city's lofty upward ambitions for economic progress. Now, these visual elements of skyscrapers and neon lights continue to dominate the Hollywood imagination of the Asian city. So we see it in lots of films set in Asia, in an Asian city. So like a recent hit like Black Panther was set in Busan. So we can see how the cityscape of Busan is neon lit in that film, or a film like Lucy, Luc Besson's Lucy, starring Scarlett Johansson, was set in Taipei because it was working with a smaller budget, but then also its depiction of Taipei is neon lit. Now, as I said, I'll be showing you a couple of clips over the next 10 minutes, the remaining 10 minutes of my talk, and I wanted to show you a clip from sci-fi monster film Pacific Rim, the original Pacific Rim film from 2013, in which the climactic battle scene takes place in hyper-modern Hong Kong, which in the film is the final bulwark for the defense of human civilization. So let me share with you this clip.
Talk. Engaged.
So in this particular clip, you can see that amid the jungle of hyperbolically neon-lit skyscrapers, we can glimpse some of the more iconic skyscrapers in Hong Kong. So one such skyscraper being the iconic Bank of China Tower, which will always appear in films set in Hong Kong. Scenes set in famous global cities almost always feature the iconic architecture associated with those cities, which forms part of that city's global brand identity. Now, since the turn of the millennium, with the economic and geopolitical rise of the PRC, more films have envisioned Shanghai as the prototype of the urban future. And I can list several films that come to mind. So like Code 46, which is less well-known, from 2003, Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, and Looper from 2013, which all feature the iconic Oriental Pearl TV tower. This next clip that I'll be showing you is from the James Bond installment Skyfall. Here in this clip, we can glimpse the Oriental Pearl TV tower in the soaring helicopter view of a neon-lit Shanghai. And then what's interesting for me also, before I show you the clip, is that the segue to the clip is a scene with James Bond saying, I don't know if this was intentional from the filmmakers, but James Bond says before the cut to the establishing shot of Shanghai, a brave new world.
Brave new world.
So Skyfall is one of those movies that are set in different locations, different cities around the world. And the aim of these types of films is to show that the global threat faced by the hero is a threat that encompasses the entire world. So these films will often be set in different locations. So like Marvel Universe films, superhero films, or spy films like from the James Bond or Jason Bourne series, or Mission Impossible series will be set in different locations to give the viewer a sense of the immensity of the global threat that the hero has to deal with. So in the case of Skyfall, it's set in London, Istanbul, Shanghai, which are all global capitals at different stages in world history. But while London and Istanbul are portrayed as experiencing stagnation or ruin through their bleached out cinematography, Shanghai is dazzling in its visualization of undulating neon lights. Now, studios often use CGI, or computer-generated imagery, to digitally enhance the futuristic quality of the setting. And this was the case in Looper's depiction of a future Shanghai. But in Westworld Season 3, so I'm not sure if you've seen Westworld Season 3, which was shot in Hong Kong's rival city-state of Singapore, the hyper-modern architecture of contemporary Singapore didn't need any such digital enhancement. So that's something interesting for me. If Tokyo, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore are the paragon of the urban future in the Hollywood imagination, then their antithesis is Bangkok. So in both Hollywood and even Hong Kong cinema, Bangkok is typically characterized by poverty, crime, violence, superstition, excess. So all these different types of negative characteristics. In films like Brokedown Palace from 1999, Entrapment from 1999, Born Legacy from 2012, No Escape 2015, Black Hat 2015, this image of Bangkok has provided the template for the representation of other Southeast Asian cities, including Jakarta, Manila, Kuala Lumpur, Phnom Penh, and Yangon. Hollywood and Hong Kong films set in Bangkok will usually disregard modern skyscrapers, sky trains, and shopping malls that Bangkok is known for. And in films like The Beach, Hangover Part 2, and Only God Forgives, Bangkok is perceived to be a refuge where tired white men abandon themselves to their excesses. In these films, buildings of Bangkok are portrayed as being dim, squalid, and dilapidated, and its streets are portrayed as teeming with the chaos of traffic bodies and debris. Films set in Southeast Asian cities also commonly feature a rooftop scene. So a lot of films set in Southeast Asian cities will have a rooftop scene, which is used to reveal the underdevelopment, scarcity, and ruin of their buildings and infrastructures. So any towering skyscraper that shoots up from the sparse cityscape is often attributed in the storyline not to local ingenuity or agency, but to foreign capital, such as a multinational investment bank in Black Hat, or a media conglomerate. In this clip, I'll be showing you from the James Bond installment, Tomorrow Never Dies, which takes place in Ho Chi Minh City. So let's just take a quick look at this clip from Tomorrow Never Dies, older James Bond film set in Ho Chi Minh City.
Another Carver building. If I didn't know better, I'd say he developed an edifice complex.
Now, the following scene that I'll be showing you, set in Jakarta from the hacker movie Black Hat. So I'm not sure also if you've seen this film, features the skeletal frame of an uncompleted building surrounded by a sparse cityscape. Now, in visual culture, images of abandoned skyscrapers often signify the abrupt flight of foreign capital because of the failure of that city's government to manage its economic development. So let's watch this clip from the hacker movie Black Hat, which is set not only in Jakarta, but then also in Los Angeles and Hong Kong and Perak in Malaysia.
Hey, I told you, you and Kassar alone.
5 men to.
And then one last clip I'd like to show you comes from Tomorrow Never Dies again, and I wanted to show you how many Hollywood action scenes set in Southeast Asian cities also involve the destruction of that city's vulnerable or fragile infrastructure. So this is again from Tomorrow Never Dies, set in Ho Chi Minh City, and it's a scene again that shows you the fragile infrastructure. Now, in this climactic chase scene, we have the heroes who are a British MI6 agent and a Chinese PLA officer teaming up together, barreling through makeshift rooms, antennas, and balconies, which easily break apart as they flee past. Now, if CGI is used to digitally enhance a setting's futuristic quality, CGI can also be used to make cities look less developed or more exotic. So the example that comes to mind are these two TV series. So one is the series called a TV show called Cold Feet from the UK, and the other is Criminal Minds Beyond Borders. So pretty obscure TV series, but then they featured two episodes that were shot in Singapore. And what was interesting was that when they shot in Singapore, they realized that the Singapore that they were shooting in didn't wasn't close to the Singapore that they had in mind. So they, in order when they went into post production, the producers for these two TV shows deleted skyscrapers and then also added Chinese language street signs and also added red lanterns in the background because the real Singapore didn't fit their image of an Asian city. And one of them even remarked that the real Singapore looked too much like Manchester. Okay, now to conclude, I talked today about sci-fi and spy narratives whose contrasting settings suggest a hierarchy between East Asian and Southeast Asian cities and populations. The question is, why exactly is this important also to know? So why is it important for us to uncover some of these hierarchies or inequalities that lurk in the background of the films that we see? So the question is, what sort of impact might they be performing in the background? And I wanted to end by showing you this chart of changing demographic of East Asian cities in our region. And just as a way of speculating about the possible social impact that some of these films might have. And in this chart, we can see, whenever I show this chart in my class or in a presentation, people are always surprised or shocked to see it. Because here we can see the projection about migration that will be taking place in Asia over the next several decades, where we have increase of Southeast Asian migrants and professionals working in East Asian cities and locations. And I think this chart shows us that we could, how important it is to start thinking about inequalities forming not just between East or West, but also within the Asian region. And perhaps we could ask ourselves to what extent our image of other locations as being chaotic, criminal, and underdeveloped might impact how we treat the people we encounter who originate from these locations. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. I look forward to our discussion later.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gonzaga. Audience, so if you have any questions to Dr. Gonzaga, so you can post your question on Q&A button. So, okay, now thank you again, and now let's move on to Dr. Darwin, and so we'll have more after his talk. So we'll have more discussion. Okay, okay, over to you, Dr.
Hi, Gaho, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry to tell you that I don't have any film clips to share in my presentation, but I will try to share hopefully something as exciting. So my talk is on why inequalities in technology matter, and some of you may be wondering, why is it that a professor of applied linguistics in the English department would be talking about technology, right? And perhaps my takeoff point really here is that, you know, at the start of the 21st century, Manuel Castells, one of the foremost kind of sociologists in the world, said, you know, in this century, technology and the ability to use it is the critical factor in generating and accessing wealth, power, and knowledge, right? And at the same time, because it has become the critical factor for accessing these, he acknowledges also that it can lead to the most damaging forms of exclusion. And so for me, as an applied linguistics scholar, especially because I also look into issues of education, I turn to that part of saying the ability to use technology, right? Because when we speak about this ability, I'd argue that there is no just one singular ability, right? It's not just about being able to press the right buttons so that you could use Instagram or make a PowerPoint presentation, but that in the end, to be able to use technology is to be able to use language, right? And also the different modalities, images, sound, for us to be able to engage in these new literacies. That is, if literacy is about reading and writing, the reality is that in the 21st century, what it means to read and write, what it means to express ourselves has been transformed, right? And that's where we need to understand if a lot of the way we express ourselves has shifted to different platforms online. How do we begin to understand ways in which technology itself can exclude us? Now, if we look at the statistics here in Hong Kong, right, out of the 7.5 million, we see that right away, everyone seems to have access to technology, right? So there seems to be no issue of the digital divide. When we look at how many percent have smartphones, right? Almost 97% would have that, right? And that's where oftentimes when we speak about inequality in technology, the so-called digital divide, by default, we turn to access to devices, right? If you look at studies, they'll say, do they have a phone? Do they have a computer, right? Now, I'd say that one component, of course, of the digital divide is access to devices, and the ability to use them is another. But first, let's take a look at access to devices. And if you take a look at how many percent of those in Hong Kong would have access to a laptop or desktop computer, you'll see that that number is already reduced, right, to less than 3/4 of the population, right? And so what does that mean then when we have something, let's say, like Zoom today, where you can be accessing this talk from a screen that is 27 inches wide or from your phone, right? Now, doing that, let me just share with you what it looks like from my end. So right now I'm using a 27-inch iMac where you could see that there's enough space for me to be able to look at my slides, to look at the chat box, to take down notes on Word, to have a browser open just in case I need to search something online if you have a difficult question like that I cannot answer, right? And you'll be able to see who the participants are, right? Now, what happens when you shift that kind of like view to a phone, right? This is something that might look like the way you'd be, seeing it. That is, you'll have participants in the screen. Of course, you'll think of that as a very tiny screen where you would have to see the content of this PowerPoint, right, in much smaller font. But the moment I want to do something else, like annotate, or I want to raise my hand, I want to chat, it means that I will have to flip through the pages, right, on my phone. And that means while I'm trying to do something else, I would not have access to the slides. I will not have access to the content that's being presented, right? And you'll see that the affordances that are available, even though we are talking about one platform like Zoom, that these will also vary, right? Depending on the kind of technology you have. The fact that I am able to do a virtual background like I'm doing right now, which is the Run Shaw building at CUHK, right? Is that for you, you have to have a powerful enough graphics card in your computer for you to be able to do this, right? And what does that mean then if you do not have that kind of hardware in your computer to be able to blur your background, and you could not then be able to kind of like engage in the same way that others might be able to engage. If you look at what you're able to also share on a desktop, that is also radically different in Zoom, right? Where I can share my PowerPoint, my browser, my Word document, like I can do a virtual background. I can do kind of like a portion of the screen. But if you look at what you can do from your phone, it really is limited to just sharing either your entire screen or looking at photos or whatnot. That also is very different in terms of what you can do in terms of writing on the screen, right? You'll see that the annotate function on a phone will be limited to just a pen, drawing arrows or erasing stuff, whereas there's so many other things that you can do, as you can see on the annotation tool on the left. Now, what does that mean then when we have students going online on Zoom to participate in class, where naturally the ways in which they're able to participate will be different dependent on the kind of device that they're using. Now, that's Zoom. Another component of that we have to think about, because this would have implications across all different platforms, right? Is that even when you're looking for searching for meaning for translations online. Now, because of I've just recently moved to Hong Kong, I haven't had the chance to conduct research with students in Hong Kong, but I've done research with secondary school students in Vancouver, where I had one student, Jimmy, and I asked him to explain what he does when he encounters a word in his science assignment that he could not understand. And he says, well, I go to my phone, which is what he has access to, and he uses Google Translate. And so in one point he would talk about, he would search for immune, the word immune, and then he looks at it at the blue box where he knows where the answer is, and he realizes that it seems like there's no Filipino word for immune, right? And so because his eye looks towards the blue box, he does not realize that there are alternate translations that appear actually at the bottom, right? Because you would have to further scroll down to be able to see this. Whereas if you were to look at a Google Translate page from your browser, which is on the right, you'll see that there are many other opportunities for language learning that are available, because you will be able to see definitions, synonyms, you'll see examples of the way the words are used, right? And right away, you'll see how the access to information will change, right? Because you would have be viewing it from very different browsers. At the same time, I have to say that the reason also that Jimmy is not able to find a Tagalog word for immune is that if you think about how Google Translate works, it relies on statistical machine translation that uses text from UN and European Parliament transcripts. Right? So the chances are, if you're looking for translations into French, Spanish, Italian, and of course English, you would get a pretty good translation. But if your language is not considered kind of rich enough to be in the to have transcripts available online, then that means you would not necessarily have translations into English that would be useful for language learners, right? That brings me to the question then, right? When it comes to these technologies, it's one thing, as you've said, that we have differential access to these technologies. But at the same time, what does it mean, right, when we say these kids nowadays are digital natives, right? They seem to be, by virtue of their age, because they were born when Google already existed, we have kind of come up with an assumption that, they have this natural ability to be able to navigate these spaces online. But if you look at, I'll just very quickly, I'll just share you examples of some two students from my research in Vancouver, Ayrton and John, who are both 16 years old. Ayrton goes to a private high school. His father, who is an entrepreneur, does work online, is able to work from home, and that's why Ayrton is able to see how technology is useful for business, right, and for doing work. He has his own room, he has his own study area, he has his own laptop, right? And so when I ask him, what do you use technology for? He'd say, I look at all the different news, I read news. He joined this currency trading course online where it costs 2,000 Canadian dollars to be part of, but then you're supposed to be at least 18 years old. But what Ayrton does is he guises his Facebook so that when they do online discussions on Facebook groups, they don't know that they're actually getting advice from a 16-year-old. right? You have professionals who are talking to him about which currency to trade in, and he's able to offer that kind of information. He was very interested in fan fiction, and he actually wrote a 150,000 word novel online in 22 installments, right? That's longer than my dissertation. Where you would have 300 followers, and there's a semi-professional author who went up to him and said, you know, I can help you improve your writing. And so he was able to get a mentor through that process. And when I asked Ayrton, you know, what is technology for you? He talks about, well, with how the world is just connected, how information is at your fingertips, you can be anyone or anything you want to be. And you can see that sense of agency about how it's useful for information. In contrast, John also owns a phone and an iPad. He shares one desktop with the family, but the mother, who's a caregiver and a single parent, uh, means that, you know, she's gone the whole day. She only arrives like after 2 shifts at 10 o'clock in the evening. She doesn't need technology to be able to engage in her work, so that when she goes home, the only time what she does when she switches on the desktop is to watch her soap operas, right? And so when I asked John, what is technology for you? And she said, oh, League of Legends. Now, the interesting thing about gaming, right? You see, while some of you who are gamers may know, there are in-app purchases where you can buy your skins, right? And you can buy your weapons, your powers. But then if you don't have the money for that, how you're able to upskill or up level is that you have to keep on playing. And that's why John, to be able to do that, will have to play 10 hours during the weekend, right? To be able to gain kind of like the powers that he wants. And when I asked him, well, how about for school? John's response is really, well, basically, I use it for printing because he has to share the desktop with his sister, who's doing a college degree. And therefore, there is no space for him to explore using the desktop to find new information. John was interested in drawing, but because he could not afford an Apple Pencil to be able to sketch beautifully using apps that would cost a lot of money, he would just sketch using his pencil, take pictures, and post it on Facebook, where he would get 1 or 2 likes, right? Because it's limited to the people who are within his friend system. And right away, you'll see the kind of difference in terms of the kind of networks that he's able to develop. Or the limitations of the people that he's able to meet because of the social media platform that he uses. And that extends to even when you think about Instagram, which is often perceived as a very upper class, middle class kind of like platform, where for you to participate, you have to have access to your beautiful brunches or your beautiful outfits, your latest vacation, and that you think Instagram is free, but then to participate in Instagram does require access to specific resources for you to be a legitimate Instagrammer. So it brings me to the question that I have, right, in terms of digital inequality, that oftentimes we think about it as, you know, just access to devices, when in fact, it's access to devices, to software, to connectivity, differences in home environments, the people that you're able to interact with, and also the different cultures that are available online. And that results in digital practices that are also valued unequally in society. So in the end, the question that I have is, when it comes to e-learning, and we talk about integrating technology into our classrooms, to what extent do we assume digital natives who know an entire spectrum of digital literacies, when in fact, these digital literacies may be very limited? And to what extent do we focus too much on the use of these technologies or platforms or tools, rather than engage with the teaching of digital literacies that will allow students of very different backgrounds, of very different access to these resources, to be able to develop the digital literacies that matter? That's it. Toja, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Darwin and Dr. Gonzaga. So yes, it's very wonderful presentations and talks. So we have some questions here. So and I have some questions as well. So basically, the questions around the topic of our discussion today: why inequalities in film and technology matter. Right. So just some questions. Maybe we'll first have some questions for Dr. Gonzaga and move into Dr. Darwin and audience. So if you have any questions, please keep posting your questions here. So we'll take as many questions as possible. So just to highlight, Dr. Gonzaga, so just to highlight the topic of our talk today. So why inequalities matter in film, basically, right? So here is one question from our audience. So I will just read it out and you can respond to this question. So in terms of visual filmic framing and stereotyping, I'm thinking about how visual animation and computer aided graphics with surreal imagination and sociocultural reimagination may provide some counter discourses to inequalities across ethnicities and geographic depiction in films and technology. I think just to highlight, so as you have presented different films, so there are different semiotic resources and representation of cities, basically, right? Mostly, uh, Asian cities. So just to highlight, so how do you see any kind of like counter discourses to this kind of unequal representation of cities?
Uh, yeah, so I think when you think about yeah, maybe some of these visual animation or computer aided graphics in the background. Yeah, so those are things that are interesting to look into. So how they might, uh, yeah, maybe change the unsettle our perception of these locations in terms of these locations being underdeveloped. Uh, but then I think one of the things you always have to think about is misrecognition. So that's one of the things we have to think about when we talk about our reception of a particular film. So how it might be misrecognized. So I can think of some filmmakers who are from Southeast Asia whose films are shown in the international art house circuit, who try to trouble some of these representations through a very a more avant-garde style in depicting these representations, but then the work ends up being misrecognized. So the filmmaker that comes to mind, for instance, is this Filipino filmmaker named Brillante Mendoza, whose films, we had some films who were set in informal settlements or squatter colonies that won awards at Cannes. So I think he won Best Director at Cannes. And two of his films are shown in competition at Cannes. And he was when his films were shown, the film I'm talking about is a film called Kinatai or Butchered, and Service. They were heavily criticized by some of the film critics who were attending the Cannes Film Festival. So like Roger Ebert, who's a very eminent American film critic, criticized the films of Mendoza being uh, for being too noisy in the background. So I think Mendoza tried to capture the sort of soundscape that you would be familiar with in a city like Manila, where people are talking, but then you can also hear in the background cars or the sound of television playing. And then in Mendoza's films, the dialogue can sometimes is barely audible because you can hear the sounds of cars in the background or television playing or other people talking. According to Ebert, this was something that he heavily criticized this because of the lack of clarity of the dialogue. So according to Ebert, the dialogue has to be advance the storyline. And then also one other criticism that Ebert has was that there was this long scene in Butchered, where you have the protagonist who is a police officer who becomes embroiled in a kidnapping, then experiencing this moral dilemma as the car where the kidnappers are riding travel through the EDSA, which is the lengthy highway in Manila. But then throughout that whole scene, his face is shrouded in darkness. So Ebert was actually very critical also of how you can't see the changing expression on the face of the actor. So Ebert's criticism was that, again, you should have some sort of clarity as well in showing the expression of the actor so that you can see this changing expression displaying this moral dilemma that the character is facing. But then according to Mendoza, again in Manila, the lights are it's very dim in the cityscape, and so you can barely see the faces of people in the high along the highway. And so yeah, so misrecognition is something very important. So these are techniques that Mendoza tried to play around with in pushing some of the boundaries of representation of film, but then they were misrecognized by audiences. And so I think that's one of the things you have to think about as well. So maybe there are some use of visual graphics or animation that try to form a counter discourse, but then they might end up being misrecognized by viewers who are watching them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gonzaga. To Dr. Darwin, so it is a quick question, but it's our audience is asking, yeah, I'm not sure if I missed out on this, so I'm just reading the question. So how long were you an observant of the 16-year-old? So the participant is asking the enemy approaches were quite amazing. So how long did you observe this participant? And with this question, so I have a quick question. So it's very interesting to look at how language plays a critical role, right, in mediating or in accessing the resources, particularly that technological tools can provide, right? Just an example of how the science concept in English cannot be really actually translated into Tagalog, for example, right? So that's why language plays really critical role in using those technology or in making sense of, right, the use of technologies as well. So so what could be the I mean, what could be some, like, based on your research, so some ways that, this kind of linguistic, in some ways, like in linguistic inequalities as, as we see in the use of technology could be bridged, right? So yeah, so two questions to Dr. Darwin. So how long did you observe the participant, and what is your perspective on these linguistic inequalities as we see in the use of technologies, particularly in terms of the knowledge, right? This knowledge gap.
For sure. Oh, so for the first part of the question from the participant, so the study with John and Ayrton was a pilot study that I conducted before my bigger study. So it was for 6 weeks that I followed these two students. I was lucky enough to be able to have gained access to their houses. They allowed me to be able to observe, right? So that meant, right, really being kind of like an ethnographer, where I am background looking at how they engage with these technologies. And yes, you talk about League of Legends and anime, and it really is fascinating for me because in my greater study where I had 18 participants and I followed them for 1.5 years actually, and being able to look at how they use technology in the classrooms, in their homes as well, right? Is that it's able to allow me to learn all these things also, right? That I'm not a gamer, but I'm able to learn about League of Legends, and I think I would link that to, for me, the linking it back to education, right? But oftentimes when teachers hesitate to kind of integrate certain digital literacies because they think maybe that they would not have the necessary competence to deal with those differences, right? I think is that it allows us to rethink what it means to kind of transform the idea of what a teacher's role should be in the classroom, right? That is, if the role of the language teacher, and this links to what you've asked, Prem, right? If the role of the language teacher is to allow students to develop the language competence, the linguistic competence and the literacies that will enable them to participate agentively, in online and offline spaces, then I think one is really being ready to engage with the digital practices of students that we ourselves as teachers may not necessarily be familiar with, right? And that's a huge hurdle, right? Because that means that the teacher will have to go to class without feeling like he or she knows everything, right? That the students themselves can bring their own practices to the classroom so that the language learning becomes relevant to what they do, and that they're able to develop these new literacies. Now, to your question, Prem, in terms of kind of like what does it mean in terms of other linguistic inequalities that exist? It is true, right? That if you look at the percentage of content that you find online, an overwhelming majority of the content is still in English, right? And that means that there are specific knowledges, if you will, there's specific ideas that are able to move forward or go to the forefront, right? That, that does not allow kind of like a broadening of kind of thinking. And I would say that that's pretty much linked, Elmo, to kind of like film as well, right? That it would, the fact that we examine Hollywood and how it's able to, to govern kind of like the industry, so to speak, in the global sense, right? And be able to have the power to determine how things are supposed to be represented. That's not unlike when we talk about when we go online. Really, the question of, well, who has the power to be able to assert their place online as well? Because these come with while we know that anyone can put up a blog, anyone can, can join social media, that the entry points are still unequal, right? Now, at the same time, I would say though, at the same time, because of social media, because that we've been chatting kind of like by writing, right? More and more that we're able to generate transcripts of languages that aren't necessarily kind of published online. But then because of chatting online, we're able to come up with corpora, with transcripts that then contribute to the proliferation of these diverse languages online, right? Because that means we're generating transcripts for these, to feed also the machines that allow these translations to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. There is another question, and which is actually my question as well. Thank you, our audience, asking this to Elmo. Basically, the question is related to the representation of underdeveloped imagination, right? Let me read the question. So, are countries that Hollywood typically represent as underdeveloped addressing this issue? I think this issue is basically the issue of inequalities, right? Are some of these countries directing funding toward domestic films that show a more modern side of these cities?
Thanks very much for the question. So these are really great questions people in the audience are asking. So, so one, I think it has to do also with clout, economic and geopolitical clout of particular nations. So, for instance, so like I think one example that comes to mind was this film called, I think, Kingsman, The Golden Circle, which was set in Siem Reap in Cambodia, which depicted Cambodia as this site of the headquarters for the illegal drug trade in the region. And the only thing that the Cambodia could do was to just ban the film. So that's the only way that they could put pressure on the filmmakers for this representation. So oftentimes the countries will or cities will just ban the showing of the film because they don't have any sort of a clout geopolitically or economically. So sometimes Hollywood films will try to target particular markets in Asia, especially those places with larger audiences, like China, for instance. But then there are other countries that if they ban the film, they really won't affect the box office of the film. So that's one factor. And then also, another thing we have to think about is the question of distribution. So it's one thing for films to be produced that maybe might feature a fairer or more depiction of the particular city, or might depict the city as being more modern. But then the question is, even if these films are produced, how are they distributed globally? So like in the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries, they have access to, they have their own filmmaking schemes. So you have a renaissance actually in Southeast Asia of all these different films being produced by Southeast Asian filmmakers, either through the help of their governments or through the help of some schemes from the Singapore government. But then the question is, how widely are they distributed in film festivals, or do people have access to these films through streaming platforms? So that's another question. And some of the research I do, I looked at actually some of the Southeast Asian films, so Filipino films that were shown at Cannes or won awards at Cannes, and many of them are films that depict Manila as a site of informal settlements. So very rarely will you see films from Manila circulating globally that will depict Manila as a cosmopolitan city. So there are certain types of films that film distributors will be looking for. Now, I think in the case of Thailand, I think Thailand has been very successful in distributing, or Thai film production companies have been successful in distributing films that show a more cosmopolitan side of Thailand. So like in Hong Kong, we've been seeing a lot of Thai films that show this the more cosmopolitan side to Thailand. The show Thailand as being a very modern city.
Just a quick follow, just a follow-up question, Elmo. So when you say distribution of those films, so there are economic rationale, right?
Sorry, could you clarify that?
So when you say the distribution of the films, so there is a more economic rationale, right?
Yeah, so in the case of distribution, yeah, there's an economic rationale. So the films will be, so for instance, they'll be produced in Thailand or the Philippines through some funding scheme provided by the Thai or Philippine governments. But then in order for them to be shown outside those countries, then they will need to be picked up at the International Film Festival. So like in Hong Kong, we have the Hong Kong International Film Festival. So the programmers for this film festival will need to pick up the films. So in many cases, Southeast Asian films will reflect a particular perception that film programmers would have of Southeast Asia. So they look for films that have a spiritual content, or portray or interest or focus on films that focus on maybe societal conflicts that people associated with these locations. And then also aside from that, you'd have distributors, commercial distributors outside of these the film festivals that will also look for films that might make money with viewers. And so there's that economic rationale in that case.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, there are some questions to Ron. So the first, I think the question, let me try to um, kind of like synthesize the question. So the questions are related to basically, how do we recognize sociocultural backgrounds of learners, particularly in using technology for literacy and educational purposes. So the first question is, how does it, how does the use of technology affect basically the the teenagers? So a group of students like between 10 to 20 these days, and what is the implication of those effects for school teachers in daily lessons, and also for parents in parenting in Hong Kong context. I think that's the question, Ron.
Okay, I'll try to answer that in the 2 minutes that I have remaining. But
Yeah.
I think definitely the first thing that when it comes to being able to integrate digital literacies into the classroom, I think it comes with being able to rethink, right, what the role is. Oftentimes when we think of what the role of digital literacies is, right, because oftentimes I think in more traditional classrooms where we think, oh, let's do the print literacies first, and then once we're able to do that, then we can move on to the digital literacies, right? Because we think that there's primacy in print literacy, but the reality of the students that we have today they're accessing all this information online. So how do we shift that paradigm? And second, how do we destabilize the myth of the digital native, right? And how do we recognize as teachers that that our students are coming to class with very different literacies and very different access to technologies, right? And that means when it comes to, if you're talking about students today and how they can be aware, I think of these differences, I can speak to, at CUHK, we've redesigned our English program, at least for the communications classes in the English department, where we integrate digital literacies from the get-go. And we talk about, what would be the difference? The fact that we're on Zoom, we talk about these differences in class, right? These inequalities of access, because we recognize that if we're talking about communication and using language to communicate, we can no longer take away this tool, this screen that's in between us. And that's where an awareness of how these tools are at work and how they manifest as different inequalities has to be articulated better, I think, in language classrooms.
So yeah, thank you, Ron. Just a quick follow-up, maybe we are running out of time, but Ron, so it is an interesting question. So what could be the some like bridging kind of pedagogy to overcome the challenges that we have in terms of using technology, particularly inequalities in technology? So how can we actually raise a critical awareness among teenage and young learners when they can learn to develop sensitivity to the inequalities in digital social life?
Thank you for that. And I think that's why in my research in the past how many years, one of the things I focus on is what I call critical digital literacy, right? And that is when we speak of digital literacies, that there are many different ways in which we use technology. We need to be able to distinguish what is functional digital literacy, knowing how to assemble language and other semiotic resources to communicate online. And there is critical digital literacy that allows us to examine the very process of communicating using these tools and how these are implicated in certain inequalities and issues of power. And I think definitely whether you're talking about secondary school students or university students, there are ways of articulating that to these students so that learning becomes transformative in that sense, rather than reproducing these inequalities that are often invisible in these technologies.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. So again, this I think so there is a quick follow-up question to Ron. I think this is very interesting question. So I have to put here. So and then question to both of you later. So the question is, because these days, rich people not allowing their children to use digital devices. I'm reading the question, Ron. So to prevent them to be addicted in internet, right? So not only rich people and the parents in general, right? If there is addiction from in using technological devices. So I would like to ask, how is it different from people who have very limited access to internet due to their socioeconomic background? It sounds like very general question, but it makes sense.
It definitely does. It's a very important question to ask. And for me, the answer can be summed up in one word, and that is choice, right? Rich people can choose not to access, technology when they don't need to, and say, I won't let my kids use an iPad in the first 3 years of their life, right? Because they choose to do that. But when they do need the information that they want, and parents can continue to use it, they will still have access to that. There is a difference when you want to find that information, you need to find that information, except that you are not able to gain access to it, right? Whether it's the limitations of your devices or the limitations of language, right? And that's where these kids who might not be looking at their iPads when they're 4 because their parents told them not to, will still kind of get the information that their parents might have been able to access online, right? And that's where I think the difference lies.
Okay, thank you, Ron and Elmo. So I think we are, almost, I think, ready to conclude now. But there is one last question, and this is the question from audience, and this is my question as well, basically. This is related to both production and distribution of technological tools, as well as films, right? So yes, as you highlighted, there are inequalities in both production as well as the use of and access of those devices. So given these inequalities, so basically in both film and technology are structured by big companies from the US. So this is from our audience, right? What critique or strategies or alternative, ways can we offer? And just to add to this question, so what could be the ways that we can really address these kind of inequalities? Or do we just talk about inequalities, or we should also talk about the ways to address these inequalities? This is as researcher and academician, it's a tough question. But what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, maybe a couple of thoughts first, just maybe to respond to Ron. I was wondering if, since, like in the case of access to the internet, so if that's one of the main sources of inequality, I was wondering if you could have maybe a shift in a paradigm shift in thinking and look at the lack of access actually as a denial of a right that people have to information. So access to the internet or access to a free internet should be seen maybe as a right that everybody is entitled to. So maybe that's something one way of addressing it. So maybe a shift in paradigm. And then maybe to address the question of my colleague, so thanks for dialing in all the way from Singapore. Yeah, I think one thing, I think we should think about it in two ways. So one is in terms of production, so in terms of funding. So maybe the importance of having these funding schemes that would then fund the production of a film or content that would show us that would provide us with a more a fairer or more inclusive depiction of different locations around the world. And then secondly, also the access to distribution circuits. So I think that's very important as well. So streaming sites or movie theaters that would show different types of content that would be more inclusive and more diverse in showing us different perspectives around the world. So so when in terms of funding, the production of diverse representations, and then secondly, the access to a more open access to the distribution circuits, so that the content that's being distributed would be more inclusive and fairer.
Yeah, thank you. The same question to you, Ron.
Yes, just very quickly, for me, it's really technology has become so much a part of our lives that it has almost become invisible, right? We're so used to it. It's like our phones are an extension of our hand, right? And the moment something like that becomes so domesticated, it becomes so much a part of every day, there are certain kind of like assumptions that we make that become also invisible, that we don't already notice the fact that these tools are made by people, designed by people with specific biases and assumptions and certain ways of thinking. And that these ideologies, if you will, are embedded in the design and the structures of these tools. And so for me, it really is about just being able to deconstruct the whole thing, and for us to keep on learning how these tools are created by people, and that how we use them is not the rule of how things are supposed to be used. That these rules that we've come up with, the conventions, we ourselves have created, and that if we have created these conventions, then we have the power also to change them.
Okay, thank you, Ron and Elmo, for wonderful
Thanks,
discussion.
Prem.
I think,
Thanks.
thank you, participants, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. And I think this is the end of yeah, our conversation. So, okay, thank you, everyone, and stay tuned. So for the future episodes of our conversation. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Prem, for hosting.
Thank you.
Great work, Prem. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.